So this build is actually a rejig of something I ran back in Crucible League, but it is inspired by what Connor's doing these days on his mana stackers, and it's I think probably the most efficient way at a very low budget to get an insane amount of damage. In the clips like this, you can see that it has just insane amounts of damage at somewhere around the 10 divine budget as well. Just to be clear, I'm not like really caring about what the 10D budget means. It's sort of like a shortcut constraint I'm using just to make builds more interesting for myself this league. I'm not really following strict guidelines or anything, but with the way that the game currently is, we've probably never been stronger, and I'm always looking for something to do, especially when I am playing softcore, just to keep me entertained. Anyways, the core of this build uses Indigon, which gives you a ton of spell damage per mana spent recently, and then it pairs it with Battle Mage's Cry, allowing that increased spell damage to also give you increased attack damage. You combine that with Manaforged Arrows, which has a gigantic more multiplier depending on the mana cost of the skill, and you've got a really, really powerful setup. Now this thing can't be a stable Indigon setup, the mana pool is too low on this level of a budget, but because I'm using Mirage Archer and Stormwind of the Conduit, the damage uptime for pure single target is actually still pretty decent, but you don't need to worry too much about attack speed in this scenario. In fact, sometimes I do need to even stop attacking entirely, just so I can allow my ramp to slow down a little bit and my mana to recover. Otherwise, it is based primarily on leash for mana recovery. There's a little bit off that mana flask that I use, but it's not super important for most of the build. It's also a one button build, it is also a bill build, so the clear is decent, but it's not super consistent because there is just highly variable damage as you go through a map, and it did take me quite a while to get used to the playstyle, so it's not necessarily something I'd recommend for anyone unless they're really, really interested in pushing this further. At the top end, I'm not really sure what it can do. I'm not really sure how consistent it can be on a Deadeye without going for like an in-stacking setup, just because it's really hard to get large access to mana. But I do think the core setup just has such a strong foundation and just insane damage numbers, really, and it is nice to have a bow playstyle to start out with. It's also using the Forbidden Jewels from Pathfinder to get perma flash sustain, but alternatively you could go for Tides of Time, which also gives you the same degree of flash sustain, but also increased flask effect. If I was going for a Progenesis setup, I probably would look to do that, and I think there is more to look at in terms of flash generation in this league, just because Tides does exist. However, Mana Flask Foreboding, I think is the prefix, has always been a bit of an annoying playstyle. I don't love it. If you do have ideas about a higher end Manaforged Indigon setup, please let me know. I'd be really, really curious to see what this does in the deeper end game, especially getting away from the int and strength stackers. But I think this core setup could be interesting to look at, something to investigate, and something that you could iterate on.